how we might be perceived. And so talking about race, it's like, okay, we don't want to come off as angry. We don't want to come off as too passionate. We don't want to come off like you're going to be tone police. So it's easier just not to say anything, to continue with the status quo and make sure everyone else is comfortable, because in our situation, that means survival. Their comfort is our survival in so many situations.
Oh gosh, you have just hit the nail on the head.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize the conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented.
We all know that first impressions count. Yet, rather than putting their best foot forward, most big-hearted, well-intended coaches are unknowingly starting their relationships with their prospective Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color clients on the wrong foot, asking questions like, "Where are you from originally? Wow, your English is so good for a Black person. Your skin tone is not dark enough. Are you sure you're from Africa?" Hey, we have a scholarship program to support people just like you. These are subtle yet gut-punching microaggressions can feel like death by 1,000 cuts for a person of color as they continually are reminded they don't belong. And that is why I will be hosting a live training called Microaggressions 101 to support you to hold safer spaces in your online coaching business that will see you serve a wider and more racially diverse audience. Head over to anigishuru.com/LT. That's Anigishuru, GICHURU.com/LT. The LT is for live training. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Represented Podcast with me, Aniki Shuru. I am super excited today because I am connecting with none other than the inclusion lady, Agyapong, who I've been following for close to a year now on Instagram. I love her content. I love how she teaches. Even though I teach this work, there's a way she does it that just helps me connect. She's so human. She talks about the mistakes she's making, the microaggressions, and it's just how she gives feedback. I love that. Amma, welcome.
Oh my gosh, that was amazing. Thank you, Annie. Thank you for having me.
And I have to start by saying that Amma's Instagram account got hacked about a month ago at the time of recording this. And so she's had to begin from scratch. But by the time you're done listening to our conversation, you will be tripping over yourself, heading over to Instagram to follow her, just because she is somebody you need to have in your life when it comes to understanding racial inclusion. So hang around. This is a conversation you will want to come back again and again. And so, I just want to ask, how did you arrive here doing this work? Because this is a question I often get asked when I'm being interviewed for podcasts. And it's not something I want to assume here. I want to make an assumption. It's not something that you had on your vision board that you wanted to teach anti-racism when you grow up.
No, you know what's so interesting, Annie? I didn't even really want to talk about race growing up. You know, we talked about it in the house. I'm here in the United States. I was raised in Miami. So we talked about it in the house, but it was one of those things when you leave this house, you try to assimilate as much as possible. So to point out your race, this is doing something completely different. And it makes my family uncomfortable sometimes, if I'm honest. But I know the vision is so much bigger than their comfort. So I keep it going. But how did I get here? So I actually started off in the financial industry. And so I started off in auditing and in finances for Fortune 50 financial industry, financial companies. And then I went in the field, I worked, and they kind of liked my style. And they're like, you're good at teaching. So I started building internship programs in the Southeast region for this company. Um, After that, I left, got my master's in business, and that is when I really started understanding the global world even more because I focused in international business. And so from there, I worked for another Fortune 50, but a retailer, and that's when I started managing a team of my own. And doing that takes theoretical knowledge and it makes it very practical quickly.
Yeah.
And so made a lot of mistakes being a leader, eventually took those mistakes and started making a name for myself of building cultures in different locations. So I would go clean it up and then go to another location, clean up the culture. And I noticed when I started recruiting diverse people that represented the markets in which we served. And then I found a way to truly make them feel included. I found a way to maximize on their strengths, hear their voices, implement some of their suggestions. I saw that that was a really great way to improve the workplace culture, in addition to having tough conversations. So from there, that's when I really got into the inclusion piece and the leadership development. But then I met a boy, got married, had a baby, and I was like, forget all of this corporate ladder trying to be VP by 30. I want to be home with my baby, okay?
Yes, yes.
So I was a stay-at-home mom for all of 4 months, got a phone call, started consulting, and that's really all she wrote. So I started in this space. I've been in the space for 15 years, but I've been able to really hone in on, yes, we focus on inclusion, but you can't focus on inclusion without focusing on differences. And while we're focusing on differences, let's talk about the one that makes you the most uncomfortable. And most times that's race. So that's the long story of how I got here. All God
Yeah.
ordained for sure. For
You
sure.
know, what's interesting, and I think what will probably pique the interest of my listeners is when you said about not talking about race, because I think for white folks, they think that for us being Black, that race is just something that we talk about comfortably and we're just cool to talk about. But the fact that there's the comfort of the privacy of being in your own space where you can talk about it, but not taking it outside, and the discomfort that that creates for us as Black people, it's not just for white folks. So we do experience discomfort, don't we?
Absolutely. And we experience discomfort just from our own one lack of knowledge, because a lot of us, especially in the US, don't know the fullness of our history.
Yes.
But it also comes from how we might be perceived. And
Mm.
so, talking about race, it's like, okay, we don't want to come off as angry. We don't want to come off as too passionate. We don't want to come off like you're going to be tone police. So it's easier just not to say anything, to continue with the status quo and make sure everyone else is comfortable. Because in our situation, that means survival. Their comfort is our survival in so many situations.
Oh gosh, you have just hit the nail on the head. Their comfort is our survival. So it's a juggle. It's a dance of trying to ensure, are they comfortable? I don't want to push the button too much. And it costs you. It comes at a cost. Sometimes talking about this will cost you your livelihood in some cases. And so it is such a delicate dance. I was going through some of your content, Alma, and I came across something where you were sharing about when you were a little kid and you were a ballet dancer. And when I was watching it, I don't know why, I just thought of Simone Biles. I'm like, oh my gosh, she reminds me so much of Simone Biles. And even as I've been
I get
preparing
that all
for,
the time.
you do, you
Yes, it's so funny. I'm
do.
like, she is amazing. So thank you for that.
I'm gonna take that. I'm gonna take
I'm gonna
that.
take it.
And so, when I've been preparing for this conversation for a little while, and my 11-year-old daughter found me going through your videos, and she's like, Mom, who's that? She's so beautiful. And I was like, oh, that's my friend.
Thank you, daughter.
I'm like, that's my friend. Her name's I actually haven't met her yet, but I've been following her for a while, and I'm going to interview her on Tuesday, which is your Monday. And she's like, wow, she like her eyes just lit up and she was just so drawn to you. And she doesn't say that about everybody. She'll find me doing my work. She doesn't say that about everybody. And I just thought, you know what, I must share that with you because this ties into your story about being a ballet dancer and the unlearning that you had to do about beauty standards. Could you talk to me about that from your lens of being that little girl who saw beauty in a different way?
Absolutely. So let me set some context here, right?
Sure.
I'm 5'1". I'm of a stocky build. So I have big legs, I have muscles. I ran track as well. And I'm a dark-skinned Black woman. And so here in America, when it comes to ballet, that is not what they are looking for. And I have flat feet. And so with ballet, for those of you not familiar with ballet, they want the nice arch and these beautiful lines. And I didn't have that. I had muscles and I had technique, but I also had a little pizzazz and I got booty and all of these things that is not okay in ballet.
Yes.
And so I would often see some of my colleagues who were tall and slim, and they would get some of these parts, even though we had the same talent or I'm even better. And I had to understand that my beauty isn't for everyone. And then, especially growing up in the 80s and 90s, when I looked on TV, the main girl didn't look like me. The main girl was like light skinned or biracial or something like that. And so thank goodness I had a mother and grandparents that poured into me on how beautiful my brown skin is. But it was definitely a lot of unlearning of one, what beauty is. This goes into even what like professionalism is, what technique is, what a beautiful dancer is, because it doesn't always have to be what you grow up seeing as classical, right? Because typically that classical ballet is the standard, that classical thin, lean body is the standard, but that's not who we naturally are. And so oftentimes you'll see these pictures that say who you naturally are is not enough. And I've had to unlearn that, as well as just being thin. You can have a beautiful, voluptuous body and still be beautiful and still be an amazing dancer. And you don't have to change anything. And that to this day, still I have to unlearn. And I think one of the videos you saw, I was talking about one of Beyonce's dancers, and I
Yes.
was saying how amazing she was. And I was like, oh, she does so well for a big girl. She has such great technique for a big girl. And my friend had to like call it out, be like, why for a big girl? Like what is that caveat about?
Mm.
And it made me reflect to say, oh my gosh, that's my unconscious bias saying that she's not enough within herself. And I'm shocked by her greatness. And I always say, if you're shocked by someone's greatness because of how they look, then your bias is showing, right? So
Absolutely. It
a
is
lot of
speaking
unlearning there.
loudly. It is speaking loudly. And I'm just thinking about how important representation is, because if you don't see it, you, number one, cannot be it. And number two, the fact that it exists allows you to see things from a different perspective, from a different lens, beauty from a different lens. Now we're in the day and age where people are inflating parts of their bodies so that they can feel more beautiful and attractive, whereas before, oh my goodness, no, 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 no. The smaller, the flatter, the more lean, that was the beauty standard. But that's not how everybody is built. And so representation plays such a huge role in educating all of us in different realms.
Yes, it does. In so many ways, I will say, even with like AI now, right? So you're starting to see a lot more like brown models or something like that. But if you look at any filter, when you take the filter, it'll keep your skin complexion the same, but it changes your features. and it changes your features to be more Anglo-Saxon. So the more narrow nose, the smaller lips, it changes your cheekbones for most filters.
Yes.
And so just imagine what that's saying to little girls growing up. That yes, you can be beautiful, but your features still have to look a certain way. And I think it plays a role going back to the workplace, because there are many studies that show those who make it to the top are often those who look different than us. And then those who make it to the top that look the same as us, oftentimes it's this gatekeeping. And they feel like they have to either be the only one or train you to be a certain way so they're not
Yes.
embarrassed. And oftentimes they don't realize that's operating out of white supremacy culture.
Oh my God.
Oftentimes, because think about in the playbook, it's separate, divide and conquer, right? So we can divide a people and have them judging each other. That's a part of the playbook, but that representation, not only for like racial differences, but also for, body size, for disabilities, it's showing that it's okay for me to be in this space as who I am. And when you are comfortable doing that, it's just so much. I always say brilliance, but it's amazing the brilliance and creativity and the innovation that comes out of that.
Absolutely.
Representation is key.
There's so much to learn because you don't know what you don't know. And if you're so used to one kind of narrative and one kind of just seeing things the same way, you never diversify, you never learn different things. And so there's so much richness when you bring in the different tapestries of who we are as human beings. And that's why we're different. We're not all the same. We're not robots. We are different. Which brings me to the conversation around what is happening right now at the time of recording this podcast, Alma. Y'all are going through a lot in the United States. It's an election year, but one like no other, because for the first time in the history of the presidential candidates, there is a woman of color, Kamala Harris. I would love to know, as the inclusion lady, how are you feeling, Ama, about what is currently going on and the language around it all?
I honestly try to stay away from the news as much as possible these days. I had to do the same in 2020, like just cut it off for my mental health. And I'm doing the same now because the way in which they're speaking about her is misogynoir at its height. And that is the intersection of race and racism and sexism. It's at its height. I mean, to down to with white people, it's oh, she's not smart enough. She didn't go to the top school. They're just questioning her credentials. But then on the black side, I've even seen things, is she black enough? And I'm like, people, we're both operating out of white supremacy. Like we don't win when we do this. Even down to, I think I posted this the other day. There was an ad and it was like vote for Trump, and it showed the suburbs, like this beautiful suburban house with the green grass perfectly cut.
I saw
And
that.
then vote for Kamala.
I saw
It's
that.
Africans at the border, like refugees trying to get through, and it just looked like dysfunction and chaos. The level of racism and propaganda that's just in one image, and that's all around who this candidate is really, really sad. What's going on here in the state? It almost feels like a reality show. So here's a question: What are you all thinking, like internationally? Because I know what we feel, but
No. We're with you. We're with you. We feel it so much because what happens in this, we're all watching. It's like this big screen, and we've all just come in, and we're all like this, and we're all watching. And there's so much disbelief when certain decisions are made, and you're like, how is that possible? How is that allowed? I mean, even when it comes to things like gun violence and police brutality, we're just in absolute shock that those things, it's a culture that is permitted, it is permitted to thrive. And it is just beyond shocking that that is just a system that is ingrained. And when we look at, presidential candidates, when we look at the political race to the White House, it is very, very interesting. And I can only speak about it from the Australian perspective because our elections are just so quiet and what I might say boring. It's just a normal day. sausage sizzle as you walk in to go vote. You come back out, you grab your hot dog or your sausage, and that's it. It's a quiet day. Everybody's trading. It's just a hum. It's just quiet. And then by the end of the day, you found out, oh, so such and such won. And they're like, no biggie, no big deal, no protest,
No
no nothing.
ads. Are there a lot of
Yeah,
ads and all of that
yeah,
stuff?
I don't watch a lot of news. I don't watch a lot of TV. I don't watch, so maybe on social media it will come up, but no, yeah, they will come up at that point in time, but it's nothing
Right.
close to what the US is. So for us, we're watching in a bit of, or I might say myself, in a bit of shock and disbelief, but also it is America. And so it is a fine line between entertainment and reality. Like you're watching in shock,
Yes.
but at the same time going like, you can't look away because it is so it's just so cutthroat. It's like when
It
you were talking
is.
about those images of this beautiful suburb, and I think Ibrahim X Kendi had
Yeah.
shared that as well, and then showing the other one where it's just like it is so not right. Like just showing, the negativity of if you vote for Harris, this is what you're getting. You're just getting your neighborhood just full of these people who you have been taught historically to fear. They're so
Correct.
different from you, and this is what you're voting for. This is the country that you're
Uh-huh.
going to be, building. And so, yeah, I think it's watching with a lot of shock, and just especially as a Black woman watching that, there's a lot of personal, there's a lot of feelings that are
Yeah.
personal, where you know that this is how people are treated, this is how they are viewed. And of course, because of that kind of talk, that kind of belief, I feel it filters and comes through to us. And so those who are here begin to think that way, begin to look at us in that way. Whilst here it is very covert, but those belief systems are still trickling down, and we end up holding those views consciously, unconsciously. And we end up, and we're going to talk about this, Ama, how we become part of white supremacy culture without even wanting to, and subscribing to those, that white dominant culture without realizing.
Yeah, I think you said so much there and extremely powerful. And I love how you said it trickles down, right? It trickles down from the images that you see because we'd be surprised how much media influences our unconscious bias. And it tells
Absolutely.
these incomplete stories. That's the issue with it. And what's even sadder is a lot of this propaganda was the same propaganda used here in the United States in the 30s, in the 60s. Like it just keeps repeating literally the same story.
It, it,
Um,
it does.
so it does. It keeps going but it works. It's
And the
fear. It's
thing
fear
is,
mongering.
it's just done in a different way.
Hmm.
Whilst it might not be, Jim Crow, but we're dealing with, mass incarceration. Like
Exactly.
it's just evolving for the times
Yes,
we're living in.
absolutely.
Um, it might not be, slavery, but we're dealing with AI that discriminates.
Absolutely.
And you can't quite put your finger on it, but you know something
Yes.
ain't right.
Yes. I mean, think about just the word diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? A few years ago, I mean, DEI, at least in the States, has been around for almost 60 years. Like it really started with the Civil Rights Act of
Yes.
1964, and it just keeps evolving, right? But the moment we started to really focus on racial differences and racial equity within the workplace, now it's become a dirty word here in the US. And when they speak about Kamala, they call her the diversity hire. They call her
Yeah.
the DEI president. And that's because that's essentially saying you have to hire a person of color, completely negating quality, and you're only focused on quantity. Just think about what that means. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in that says, well, why can't I just hire the best person for the job? Why do I have to hire the person of color? And I immediately ask, well, why don't you assume the best person for the job is the person of
Is
color?
qualified.
Like, it's the best person for the job. That's
Yes.
the most qualified person.
Yes.
I mean, that Why don't you just assume they're the person of color, right? And that shows the unconscious bias. But like you said, all of the language and the images that we're seeing, especially now dealing with Kamala, it's
Mhm.
worse, I feel like, than it was with President Barack Obama. It's just feeding on this international stage.
It sure is. And I wonder, what do you think of the words that Malcolm X spoke in a speech back in 1964 in comparison to the times we're living now in 2024, when he said the most disrespected person in America is the Black woman, the most unprotected person in America is the Black woman, the most neglected person in America is the Black woman. Do you feel that is still a truth in 2024?
I do. I do. And I think it's even worse now. And here's why. Because here in the United States, there was a study that came out from Essence magazine that said Black women in the United States are the most highly educated group of people here in the United States. The caveat with that is we also have the highest student loan debt. Um, with that, we also have high divorce rates. And so oftentimes, Black women in the United States are trying to build these careers. They're getting the education, but they're also the ones carrying the family. And so that comes with a lot of stress. And that comes with this, we talk about masculine, feminine energy. You start to form into more of this person that has to really do both roles within the household for someone who believes in gender roles. And it leaves the Black woman feeling very unprotected, unseen, stressed out, but still working through it. And so that's why I'm not a fan of the word resilient, because it's like, yeah, take the crap and keep it moving,
Right.
right? Without addressing what it actually is. And then we live up to this stereotype of being the angry Black woman or the strong Black woman or the mammy, the one who has to take care of everyone else. So even if you're upset, you cannot respond the way in which you want to because you have to make sure everyone else is okay. And that is expected of you. Or if you're in the workplace, you're doing the job of yours and your managers and everyone else's, but you better not say anything about getting paid for it, right? So it's all of these things. And then on top of that, I'm sorry you got me on my soapbox. You have a lot of Black, I'm not going to say a lot. You have some Black men who then say, I don't want to date Black women because of attitude, because of being too strong, because of being too bold. And so you get all, or because Black women aren't submissive. And I don't hear that about other races as much as ours. And so, to your point, I feel it today for sure. And when I talk to my grandmother or when I talk to elders in my family, it feels like it persists more today, even than it did back then.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I did not expect that response. I thought you were going to say
Yeah.
it is still
No.
the case. But how you've even broken it down and shared really practical examples that we can all, really try and
Yeah.
understand and see is we're regressing. We're not making progress. We're
No.
moving backwards. And I know I will ask the question later on, like, how do we move forward? How do we
Yeah.
unite? And so perfectionism is something that
Oh,
comes up
let's talk
over
about
and
it.
over again. And we know the danger of perfectionism and we're told steer away from it. It's better to do your best and rather than try to aim for perfectionism. But I think there's a little bit of that we all suffer from. But I think what's important to highlight here is that it's a tool of white supremacy culture. And it plays a really powerful role when it comes to Black women in leadership and the narrative it crafts around their worth, because it feels like there's a measure that is tied to how perfect you are, and that correlation with who you are as a human and your worth.
Absolutely. And if we think about perfectionism, that means there has to be a standard or a bar. And who sets that? And what is the standard and
That's
what is the bar? Right? So it really does start there. Um, And I just read an article in Psychology Today about that exact thing. Like one of the ways to negate perfectionism is to just try to do your best. And that's so easy to say. But when you've been indoctrinated in a system, and the more education, the worse it is, right? The more education, the harder it is to drop this perfectionism. The more socioeconomic stability, the harder it is to drop it. Because when we look at class, right, as a caste, it
Mhm.
it really does set the stage for perfectionism, and the closer to white or the higher class, the higher caste you are. And so that is something that is really, really hard to drop, especially when you're constantly reinforced. And I hear organizations like, oh, well, that's why we have this mentorship program to help, let's say, women of color. And okay, that's great, but are you mentoring them to be the leadership model that was never created with them in mind in the first place? Think
Absolutely.
about that. The leadership model is typically a white, middle aged man. And so when we mentor, or we have these programs, it's typically to get them to assimilate more to be that model versus saying, let's tear down the model and now focus on what is best for this team. And that's why I'm so happy Harvard Business Review did a study on recreating executive presence. And it's phenomenal because it now talks about executive presence being authenticity and honesty and integrity and inclusion, and how you really do create a sense of belonging on your team. And when they talk about your presence, because this comes up with Black women, I shaved my head recently. My family almost flipped out. Like, girl, what are you doing? You're not going to get any clients or jobs. And I'm like, they're going to have to accept me with how I am, right? Because typically, what do Black women do when it's time to prepare for an interview or all of those things? We straighten our hair. We have on the suit, we change our clothes, we don't have bright colors on, we do darks, right? Like all of those things. And this article kind of redefined that. So it includes all communities. And so, sorry, I know I went off on a tangent, but for Black women, it's really about what is my executive presence. And when I am coaching Black women, the first thing I ask is, what is your superpower? What is it? And oftentimes it's hard for Black women to even say what it is, not what they've told you. What is your superpower? And I need you to double down on that. So, what does it mean to double down on your superpower? What does it mean with your team? What does it mean with your leaders? What does it mean with your family? What does it mean with yourself? Um, and so, yeah, that. So, perfectionism is definitely a theme we're all working through. But I think if we start with what do we bring to the table and how can we authentically do that, it gets us closer to progression and not perfection.
Wow, that's just a whole masterclass right there that you've dropped for us. But digging deeper into the idea of mentorship, because mentorship is something that we're not short of. We've got mentors, we've got people who are, you know, kind of coming in and saying, oh, do this, do that, and the other. But I feel like mentorship has a lot of potential and it's not being used to its full potential, especially, and I came across this on your posts, and it was around the fact that when it comes to mentorship, there's almost like a gatekeeping process behind it. I know you have this skill. You're the inclusion lady. You give phenomenal feedback. You teach people how to give feedback, and you have this way of just sharing stories that are so allow us to understand so much deeper and see how we can the mistakes that we are making and how we can do better. It's not just telling us this is wrong and that's that. And I'm like, I think you would be such a great connection to this person. I'm going to call this person and make that connection, or I'm going to send that email and I'm going to connect you too. There isn't that. It's that person going like, well, change this, do that. But you have a whole list, a whole, your contacts with all these people who you could connect this person to, but you're not.
It's so true. It's so true. I liken it to like someone who's like dating a person for years but never like proposes, right? Um, and and
Wow.
and I'm going to give the caveat of that is fine if both people are on the same page, but oftentimes they're not. And so I feel like that's what mentorship is often. Like we're courting, we're dating, we'll communicate, but how do we like put a ring on it? And you put a ring on it by helping with growth, whether it's socially, financially, professionally. And that's the piece that's often missing. And I think if people are really honest in their feedback, they're probably not comfortable in doing that just yet. And I think having the conversation as to why you're not comfortable will probably be more beneficial to that person than not, and then gatekeeping. Because it's typically something that's holding someone back from opening up the
Absolutely.
gates.
And it's not just white people with black folks.
No,
It is
no.
black folks with black folks. It's like, okay.
Absolutely.
It is something there. And I wonder if it is tied to white supremacy. I wonder if it
Oh,
is
it is.
to say more.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is because, like, when you look at the history of it, it was often just one person that they would allow. So, even think about like slavery here, and I'm going to, of course, I have a US context, but slavery here in the US, it was okay, we're going to have these one or two in the house, and then everyone else is going to be in the field. And the one or two in the house have to look a certain way, right? So, that is setting the stage of division.
Divide and conquer.
Even a lot of the historically Black universities and colleges here in the United States were founded by white abolitionists. And even with the white abolitionists, they would have these historic Black universities and not have Black presidents for the first 30, 40 years, right? And so the person who makes it to the top, then they have, I think they call it, it's not token, well, it is tokenism, but it's this like meritocracy where it's the idea of you're different. And so they pump this person up to be like, you're different, but different meaning more like me and less like your people. And so now that person, that Black person, is gatekeeping because they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to be kicked out of that club. And I think that is 100% white supremacy. And how that perpetuates is now when it's time to mentor, now when it's time to connect people, you're holding them to this perfectionism or
Yes.
this unrealistic standard because that's what you were held to. So it's a lot of history behind it. And if you don't, I'm reading this book right now called Our Kind of People, and it's about the Black upper class here in the United States. It's a phenomenal book by Lawrence Graham. But the more I read it, and the more I realized I wanted to be that and be a part of that, that's why I got all the degrees, that's why I did all the things, the more I realized I was really operating out of white supremacy. So
Wow.
reading this book is really helping me decolonize myself because that's what these people, they wanted to exist in a certain way, which is really just closer to that white standard.
Whiteness. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Oh my goodness. So one thing, and I've mentioned this as we've been talking, one thing that you do really well is you share short stories with powerful examples of how to give feedback. And this has resonated so much with your followers. Why do you think people struggle when it comes to giving feedback in a constructive way?
Yeah.
I love particularly when you gave the example of intent versus, and in particular, after you read the book Black Fatigue, and you were trying to understand the story that you shared about your son's swimming teacher, why he did so well. He was so challenged with one, but then with the other, and you try not to make it about race, but it did come back to race. Could you share a little bit about that when it comes to giving feedback in a constructive way?
Yes. Oh my gosh, Annie, thank you for bringing that up. So I do love to tell stories of like just real life examples because I feel like if people see I'm not perfect as a Black woman, then white people will feel more comfortable to say, okay, well, it's okay if I'm not, and it's okay if I make mistakes because she makes them and she talks about them. So maybe I can get my foot out there a little bit more. And with that, I really was trying not to make it about race, but I just noticed it was this level of niceness, this word nice,
Yeah.
that she was really nice, but there was no challenge there. And I look at it from both sides. For white people, I understand if you are on this journey, you're trying not to make a mistake. You're trying to right the wrongs of your ancestors. You're trying to unlearn all of these things and integrate with the group of people you've never had to even learn about. Right? Think about that. There's this quote by T.D. Jakes that says, I could not get a GED without learning about you, but you can get a PhD without learning about me.
Mm.
Right? Right.
Preach.
So it's a struggle, and I understand that. So when it's time to give feedback to someone, I think the worst thing a white person wants to come off as is racist or prejudiced, and so they're not sure what to say, and so they rather not say anything, or they're just nice. And that's what this coach was for my son, and it just wasn't progressing him. Whereas when he went back to his black male coach, it was like, no, I know you're better than that. You're giving me, half of what you're capable of. Let's go harder. And I think it's just that idea of, I know you're capable of the insurmountable, of the unlimited. I know what you're capable of, and you push them towards that. Versus operating from a deficit model. Whereas, and she talks about this in the book, where you're operating from this deficit model, and so you're not sure how to approach the person because you already don't think they can do a lot. And for many people to be like, no, I don't think that, but subconsciously it comes off as such. And so I think specifically white people, it's a part of white supremacy culture. They don't give each other feedback. Tima Okun, lists that out. So that's not Alma talking about it. It's in a lot of studies. That direct feedback is just not a part of the culture. But I think it's about not wanting to make a mistake. So you're not sure about how that person's going to perceive you. You don't want to say the wrong thing. It's very self-centered if you think about it, because it's all I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to be seen as a certain way. Meanwhile, you're not thinking about how these words can help that person grow. So you're not focused on the person. And so when you do intent versus impact, oftentimes it's, well, what I mean to say, what I want to come across, versus how is this person experiencing me in this moment? And if it's not a good experience, let's address it and let's talk about it. So that's the beautiful thing I love about feedback, because it's the quickest way to grow someone's career. And it's one of the most stifling things that happen in corporate America, specifically for Black women.
I think it's how you give feedback, because there's a way you can give feedback where you cut somebody down to the smallest pieces possible, but there's a way that you can, like, calling in people, calling them in and going like, when you said that, I don't think you intended to say it that way, but this is how it landed. Talk to me about that, giving them like that safe space to come in and share where they're not feeling judged. But I feel like a lot of the times people are just so uptight in how will I be perceived, and it doesn't allow there to be opportunity for growth. Feedback is just hasn't been given in the best way possible, or no feedback at all. We'll just be quiet about this, and just maybe we'll performance manage them out of the role.
Right. But you know what, Annie? I think at the very foundation of it, I think people haven't spent time building relationships.
Wow.
And that is the issue. Because there's, again, another study that came out that showed there's a 5-to-1 ratio. So for every 5 times you encourage someone, that's the 1 time you can give constructive criticism. And obviously it's not a direct science, but oftentimes the people aren't spending time truly building relationships and learning what someone's brilliance is, learning who they are outside of the office, learning something about them that's not on the resume, learning who they are as a human being. Because then when you have that foundation of a relationship, then you can say, I trust you enough to show you my flaws, right? And when it's that relationship, now you can have a different type of dialogue. And the premise of, do you have my best interest at heart, is already there. And so I think, especially in the workplace, we don't spend enough time truly cultivating relationships. We go straight into work, straight into feedback, straight into what needs to be done. And so then when you layer difference on top of that, I've never dealt with someone like you. Now I'm scared to really build a relationship. I'm awkward. And because of my job, I got to give you feedback. It just doesn't come off well. But even for someone who doesn't know how to build a relationship, I would say when you are giving feedback, one, make sure you find the data point because that is going to truly tell you, is this my bias and my preference, or is this something that's truly impacting the business? I'm going to pause there and let that land because oftentimes in corporate America, especially Black women, are getting feedback that's not actionable and typically based off of someone's feelings. So find the data point. How is it impacting the business? How is it impacting the team? That will typically let you know, is this a personal preference or is this something I truly need to address?
That is just so much gold there to try and remove that bias. But I want us to dive deeper into bias. I want us to dive deeper into deconstructing this white supremacy culture that we're not immune to it. Even as educators ourselves, Alma, we're not immune.
No.
And so what work have you done on yourself personally to try and deconstruct this? And one of the posts that I have engaged with that you shared was when you were saying that you love authors, speakers, and you gravitate to white speakers
Men.
a lot. You know, your Simon Sinek's, your Adam Grant's, and all of those big phenomenal names. John Maxwell, who you
Oh,
absolutely
oh my God. You know, I love him. I call him Uncle Johnny.
there
I'm
you
going
go,
to meet him
Uncle
one
Johnny.
day.
So there is that thing, like even for me, before I really started really zeroing in on this work of DEI, a lot of my books were books that were white authors. I did not know that, Amma, until I was, in the trenches of this work. I was like, hang on, who have I been learning from? Who are the people that I quickly don't even question and give my money to? Where am I making my investments? And where do I hold off and go like, I'm not too sure? Where is an area for you? Or rather, how have you been trying to deconstruct this?
Yeah. So, oh my gosh, I'll give you the short. So, similar to you, who do I learn from? Who do I look at as a subject matter expert? When I'm also looking at building a business, who am I
Yeah.
looking towards? Right. Because even to this day, if I'm truly, truly honest with you, Annie, I still go to white males when it comes to building a proper business structure. Because I feel like, and this sounds terrible, but I feel like they are the gold standard right now because they like created this capitalistic society. So I'm
Yeah.
like, well, let me look at their playbook. And it's something I'm still, again, deconstructing.
Mhm.
But some of the things I've done, so therapy has helped a lot, a whole lot, to just see like where does it come from? Because growing up in a middle class conservative Black family, you don't realize how much that instills white supremacy in you. um Even when you're hearing you got to do more, be better because you're Black, you go in that work, you give your all of that. That's white supremacy. You don't dress this way, you wear your hair that way, you speak
Mm.
the king's English, you engage a
Mm.
certain way, you don't do this too loud, all of these rules to just live, right? Whose rules are these? Whose standards? So still even unlearning that because I noticed like I'll correct my son's English like all the time because I feel like he has to speak a certain way. And it's like, where is that coming from? And is this necessary right in the moment, right? Um, and so therapy, books, and I make sure again I'm starting to diversify like the books that I read. That mindfulness and that stillness. I think having a great accountability group of friends that are different than me is so helpful because Annie, there was once upon a time in my life where I was like, if it's quote unquote ghetto, I want no parts of it.
Yeah, I feel you on that.
Right? Like this is me like my full authentic self, which is one of the reasons why I even contemplated divorce for so long before actually doing it, because I was like, I don't want to be a statistic. I don't want to be another broken Black family. I don't want to fit this model. I did all the right things to not be that. Again, that's white supremacy culture. And so therapy has helped unlearn a lot, but also that accountability group from different backgrounds, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different upbringings, different cities, states, countries, to really question me on, why did you just say that? Or why did you
Mm-hmm.
feel that? Or why do you do that? It stings at first, but then typically at its core, it's colonialism.
It
So,
is. It is colonialism. I'm remembering like when your son came home from school, and he's like, "Mom, I made a friend. His name's Carlos," and you're like, "Oh."
does Carlos speak Spanish? He's like, Mom, why would you think he speaks Spanish? I'm like, oh gosh, I did
Yeah.
it again.
And we're all guilty. We're all guilty of it. And you catch yourself. As soon as somebody points it out, you're like, go no further. I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Yes,
And
yes.
it is a constant
Oh,
unlearning.
it's a journey. Oh my goodness, it is. And I will say it's not making the mistakes. Obviously, there are some egregious mistakes we just shouldn't be making,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like I had a client one time who referred to, we were in the middle of Alabama, and she referred to Black people as colored. And I had to stop the conversation right there. And I'm like, ma'am, she was like in her 70s, still no excuse, man. We just don't say that anymore, right? Like I had to correct her.
Yeah.
But typically the mistakes we make are not intentional, and it's not the mistakes we make, it's how we recover from them. And I want everyone to remember that. It's how you recover. The gold is in how you recover your accountability in the moment, and then how you then show action to do better. If you're doing that, you're on this constant journey, and then you're going to find joy in what you learn, but it's all in the recovery.
Oh, and this ties in so well with my next question because it's what's one thing when it comes to racial inclusion you wish we understood better, specifically when it comes to like online coaches. You're a coach yourself. Um, One of the things that comes to mind is people who were raised not to see color. You know,
Oh,
that's one thing for me. What's one thing for you that you feel, I wish white people knew this, specifically because it would really help us along this journey of racial inclusion?
oh, that is a great question. So one, I will say different is not deficit. So though that person's different than you, they grew up differently, they might come from a different socioeconomic background, they might have a different level of education. It's not a deficit. There is magic in the difference. So let's find out what that magic is. So that's number one. Um, Number two, I wish that they understood curiosity and humility, because again, you've never had to learn about people different than you. Typically, think about what the history books are, right? Think about our neighborhoods, think about our schools. Like someone can literally go from elementary school all the way to a PhD and not really have to engage with Black people a whole lot, especially if you're of a certain socioeconomic status. So that humility and curiosity to say, I really don't know in this area. How can we learn from each other? I think it's just so important. Like I wish they understood difference is not deficit, celebrate it. And then this is an area where you need to have humility and curiosity.
Oh, so well put. 100. If you're not taking notes, you will need to pause here and rewind back and listen to this again. This is absolute gold. So, when it comes to advocacy and allyship,
Mhm.
what, in your opinion, can white women do to help bring about racial equity, be it in business or personally for them?
Yeah. So one really practical thing I would say is join an organization that is predominantly of another race, but don't join the organization to try to take a leadership position. Join the organization to be of service. And why I say that is because oftentimes I will see, white women on nonprofits or white women on different boards or helping the needy, the hungry, all of those things, but it still puts you in a superior position where you're having to give to someone and that someone needs you. So subconsciously, you're still not looking at them as an equal. And that's not helpful. And so joining an organization where you're working side by side with someone that has the same vision as you, the same value system as you, really helps to start, reprogramming that unconscious bias. But in those moments, I would say truly listening. So some of my trailblazing white women friends, I love them. And sometimes they become in the US, we love this woke word. They become more woke than the Black woman. And then it's like they start trying to educate me on different things. And that piece
That part.
it still centers you, right? It still centers your knowledge as a white person. It still centers your whiteness and puts you at a superior level. So I think the listening piece, I know we hear it all the time, and some people be like, practically, what does that mean? Well, practically, what it can mean is you're listening to learn, you're asking open-ended questions, you're asking questions such as, how did you experience that situation in the moment? And you're just learning. You're not jumping to conclusion. You're not trying to give a solution. Don't try to give solutions because you might not know what's best. And when you do give a solution, you're saying, I know what's best for you. You're literally listening to learn. And in the moments where you feel like maybe I could have been an ally or I want to be an ally, when you go offline, ask someone, how would you like me to show up for you? Next time, what would you like me to do in that situation? Right? That helps to build the gap and that bridge of partnership and unity versus this power dynamic that exists in white supremacy culture. Does that make sense what I just said?
Absolutely. And I want to share with
Okay.
a learning that I got just to amplify what you shared there. I had this aha moment as I was teaching, whereby allyship, support Black businesses. And when white people would come in and support Black businesses, it's like they were doing them a favor, Alma. It's like, I'm supporting this little Black business over here because without me, or rather they need me, but they're getting it all
Yes.
twisted. They're not supporting because they want your service. In their head, they're supporting so that they can keep your doors open, but they're not looking at the reciprocity of, you're getting a great service from me. Like, you're
Service.
coming to me and I am serving you. So it's not just about you supporting my business. And that was such an aha moment, in that
Yeah.
it's not a power dynamic here. It is,
Yes.
we're equals, we there's unity, and it's not about you being here and kind of lifting, but we're doing this together.
Annie, I kid you not, like I've had situations where, there is a workshop or a training or, whatever from my organization. And I will hear like, we only want AMA, right? And on the surface, that feels great. But then I ask myself, would they say that for McKinsey, McKinsey consulting firm? Would they say that for Pew Research? Would they say that for Deloitte? Would they say that for the John Maxwell Company if he said he's sending one of his certified speakers? Probably not, right? So even within that, there's this power dynamic. You're expecting something from the small Black owned business that you would not expect from a white organization. And we really have to check that. It even goes down to pay equity, like what they pay small Black businesses versus what they would pay others. Because again, it's like I'm doing you a favor versus I'm receiving a really great service.
Yes.
And on the reverse, for Black businesses, you also got to know your worth and be okay and operate from an abundance mentality to say no and know that when that door closes, another door will open, because it will just continue. It will just continue if not. Yeah, I'll stop there. I was going to say I had one more thing I wanted to mention. It was something that recently happened. It'll come back to me because it was about that in particular.
Okay.
It was about that in particular, probably come back to me. But yeah, though, just the power dynamic when it comes to operating in businesses and looking at each other as equals. And it happens unintentionally, but it's something to definitely be mindful of.
Absolutely. Last question. Last question.
Okay.
We made it.
Okay.
We made it to the end.
This was so great.
I love asking this question, and please take your time to answer it. But it is, if fear was not a factor, how do you think you'd show up in your work?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's good. I probably would focus more on anti-racism than I do. Yeah. Because right now in the US, organizations are so afraid of that and racial equality, where I have to dilute my message sometimes and really focus on inclusion, which I believe in inclusion 100%. But you really can't delve into inclusion without talking about differences. And all the studies show that the experience of Black people are some of the lowest. Black and Latino people here in the US are the lowest, from promotional rates to pay to everything, right? And so if I didn't have fear, I wouldn't dilute my message as much, and I would come in guns a-blazing, focused on only race versus like everything else that I incorporate. That's what I would do.
Thank you. Thank you for being on it. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
Because I know
that's such a good question.
People struggle with that. People
Mhm.
struggle with that. Like, how do I give this truly, authentically? But thank you. I can feel that. I can feel it in my bones.
Yeah. Yeah.
No.
It's the balance, right, Annie? Like it's a balance for being palatable and effective.
Mm.
And sometimes it's like I'm looking at the greater good. How can I get my foot in the door to really make a change in this organization for everyone? And it's again, how can I be more palatable? And sometimes being more palatable really does mean like diluting the message.
Yeah, dicing up that meat, making it chewable.
Right.
And so, where can people find you and connect with you?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that. So I am that inclusion lady on Instagram and TikTok and all of the things. On LinkedIn, I am that inclusion lady Agyapong. So it's pretty consistent there. I own Inclusion Enterprises. So you can find me on inclusionenterprises.org. We really do focus on leadership development, focused on inclusion. We do inclusion strategies, workshops. I'm a speaker. So we really focus on coming into your organization and focusing on your leaders because they make such a huge impact on your team, and getting them up to speed with inclusion, and managing the dynamics of difference. So that is what we do at Inclusion Enterprises. And so would love to hear from you, even if it's in a DM or an email. Would love to hear from you all.
Oh, why don't you do this? If you've reached this point of this conversation, why don't you tag Ama and let her know that you listened to this episode. Tag me as well. Let us know that you listened. Share what maybe was an aha for you or what you enjoyed hearing about. But just let us know that you listened. And then please go ahead and follow her, because she is somebody, she is a gem that you need to have in your backpack when it comes to inclusion work. So go ahead and follow her right now.
Oh, thank you, Annie. And you know what? For that, the first person to tag me, we'll schedule some one-on-one time.
Ooh, I
Yep,
might be
first
the
person
first
to tag me.
I'm tagging.
Yes. We will schedule some one-on-one time to just maybe talk through, like do some on-the-spot coaching, talk through a situation that maybe you want to know how to handle it. Yeah, first person tag me. Let's do it.
I love that. Ama, thank you so much. I have loved this conversation.
Oh, me too.
And I am so grateful for you for being here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Annie, and thank you for all the amazingness that you're doing and putting into the world. You're incredible. So I was honored to be a part of this, and just keep being amazing. So thank you again.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented from coast to coast.